you. So you're on the back, and the stand that was where I used to stand as well. In a time that feels not distance, but which is, unfortunately. So thanks a lot for coming and for still being awake after last session. I'll try to be keeping you awake. So, okay, I know you are changing. So yeah, as Bruno said, I will just say a few words about who we are and where I speak from. And then even if this session is in, entitled From Ideas to Influence, with the case of green monetary policy. And I will be talking more about influence than ideas, in the sense that I'm not an expert, and I'm not going to talk about hardcore technical monetary policy, but rather about how to make those ideas happen in the EU political context. So there's going to be a part in the middle on some reminders or basics on the EU institution, how it works, how the politics of it works, to then go to sort of how we do it at Positive Money, especially on the green monetary element. So just a few words about us. As Bruno said, we are a non-profit organization. We are technically based in Belgium. We're an ASBL, so Association Sans But Lucratif. I don't know how many French speakers there are here, so there might be a few words. And we have this very broad mission that we believe strongly that it is possible and it should be done, that we can redesign our economic system, both for a livable and a just planet. So it's a bit of a core sort of social and green and democratic angle. We say economic system, but as Bruno said, and it's in our name, we did start from a very strong focus on monetary policy. And so in this sort of small ecosystem of organization trying to reform the economic system, we're really trying to focus on the niche of the niche, which is monetary policy, and in our case, the European Central Bank operations. Just for a little bit of background, we basically, you might have come across our name, or you might at some point also check our website. You will see that we have an organization that has an office that I represent, which is in Brussels, Positive Money Europe. But originally, we were created in the UK, just after the financial crisis of 2008-2009. And that was really like one of the first organizations trying to reclaim people's power over the financial system. I mean, that was definitely one of the big moments where, well, a lot of people realized that something was wrong with the financial system. And basically, just so that you know, with Brexit, amongst others, that team in the UK realized that it was going to be complicated to continue to have an influence a bit broader in Europe, and so they set up like a different office, which is us. So we're a team of about 10 people. Bruno here is actually has been with us for almost a year as a senior researcher, even if you also know him as a professor. And maybe just to say about myself, so that you also understand where I speak from. I've been director of the organization for a bit less than a year, so still a bit recent. And I do have a background in politics and in green politics, to say it very bluntly. I've been working around 15 years, I would say, backstage of politics. So I worked in the European Parliament for a green member of the European Parliament, actually just after the financial crisis, so on the financial regulation of that time. And then I was director of the Green European Foundation, which is an organization doing research, capacity building, but more broadly. And I also worked in Belgium, because I'm Belgian, not French. It's always important to mention. I also worked for a green minister, so on climate, energy, mobility over the past 3 years. So rather deep dive into daily politics, but always a little bit from the backstage where you can observe and see how it goes. So I will be definitely having, I mean, it's important that you have that in mind, because that is also what I'm going to be talking about. So yeah, our priorities, as I said, we have this broad mission, and we are not the only one. You may know of New Economics Foundation, Finance Watch, Sustainable Finance Lab. Those are all organizations that we're kind of part in this ecosystem and that are trying to influence policies, especially at the EU level, to reform the economic system. And in our case, we definitely have that focus of central banking. I'll talk a lot about the European Central Bank. Also the future of money, so we won't touch on that today, even if it's like a super important topic and Bruno is very much engaged with. You might have heard, and if you haven't, I encourage you to check. There is a debate right now on developing a digital euro in times of cryptocurrency, etc. It's quite an important way of reclaiming sovereignty and public ownership of digital money. So quite an interesting one, but I won't talk about it. And I'd rather talk about what is part of our priorities around how do we make the monetary system and the financial institution contributing to the green transition, contributing to the very much needed investment in the green and fair transition. I also want to address the last point, which I believe was a bit connected to the lecture you just had before. So we do have a very strong democratic and equity approach. We are engaged on a project and journey to dismantle systems of oppressions. We are really trying to move quite far there into intersectional approaches, etc., and which is both on our own practices, but also looking at big institutions like the European Central Bank and how they are or are not representing diversity in society, how they are or are not, probably are reproducing power structures, etc., which is like super interesting as well, but well, we only have an hour, so. And this, I mean, I'm not going to dive into that, but maybe just because I'll just rather give examples later on. When I explain to my friends what do I do as a job, the shortcut is to say, yeah, non-profit organization, focuses monetary policy, and we do lobbying. And I hate this word because when we're the good guy, when we feel that we're the good guy, we don't want to say we do lobbying, and it's a bit of a shortcut. But eventually, yeah, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to influence policy making at the EU level, and to do that, we have different modes of actions, and we combine developing the ideas, so the sort of research part, and then advocating for them, whether directly with policymakers or through education, communications, etc. So these are like, yeah, just the way we're working. So yeah, this is just so that you know where I'm talking from, you know more or less where our organization is. But I will dive now into, and I didn't look at the time, so you will have to tell me at which point. Oh yeah, it's there, great. Then it's fine. So I'll go a bit more into, because to understand how to influence European policies, you kind of have to understand how it works. Maybe just a very quick show of hands of who feels comfortable with how the EU policy making works. Yeah, I think the show of hands is clear now. That is kind of okay. It's kind of more than average people, which is, if you think of it, rather crazy that EU policy making is not part of compulsory anything. Of course, people not from the EU understand this is not at all compulsory, but still, as a Belgian, it's not something I learn at school, but rather later on. So like a super, I think, I like going back to basics. That's just a way to make things clear and to, yeah, just remember what you're talking about. So a way to sum up what is the EU, European Union, it is different things. It's many things. I like to think of it as at least three things. It's, on the one hand, a common project. That's probably the story most of you have heard, is a common project of peace just after World War II. On, okay, we want to have peace on this continent, so let's just cooperate economically, but to make sure we don't start killing each other again. So that's like the sort of basic argument, which has evolved and maybe, well, disputable, maybe not something that everyone wants, but it is the core of what the EU is. It is something common. It is something in itself that is more than the two other components that are still important. The EU is also the 27 member states that are composing it. And when we talk about the EU, we talk about the entity as a common project, but we also talk about the different member states, the different countries that are composing it, and that each have their own priorities, their own dynamics, their own realities, their own history. And the EU is also the people. And again, it may or may not be shown too often, but it is also a way to describe the European Union. It is the 450, keep forgetting that word, that number, millions of citizens that are European and that are what makes Europe as well. And so why am I going like to those different elements is because this sort of very simple way of explaining what the EU is also translating in what the EU institutions are, or what they are supposed to be, and how they interact with each other, and why we do have so many weird institutions in the EU, because they are representing those ones. So, this looks complex. I tried to find something that was not too complex. It is kind of okay. Going back to that triangle, you know, I'm sure you've heard, European Commission, Council, European Parliament. Those are words people usually have heard of or that are in the news, etc. Those three, they are the main institution in the EU. Why am I saying main institution? Is because they are the one having a power in the decision making. They are the three institutions that have a decision power when it comes to making European law. And they are representing exactly what I was saying. So even if it doesn't seem like it, the European Commission is supposed to be the embodiment of that general interest, of that common project. It is supposed to be neutral. It is supposed to be, it is there with the main mission of protecting, being the guardian of the treaty, so being the guardian of the values, being there to check if whatever is decided is implemented well by the member states. And it is also why the European Commission is made of public servants that are there to serve the project as a whole. Of course, and there's going to be a lot of that kind of parenthesis in what I'm going to say now, it's not that straightforward, and it's a bit confusing because currently, and since the beginning, the European commissioners are still the same number as the number of member states. They've been growing every time there was a new member state, and each member state gets to nominate one of the commissioner. That's the way it is, and so it can give the impression, oh, you know, well, the member state have some power there, and it blurs a bit the cards, but essentially, it's still that European Commission is that representative of the general interest. The second one, so I was saying European Union of 27 member states, this one is quite straightforward because indeed, when it comes to negotiating and deciding on EU law, the member states, the countries, also get a seat as a country. So meaning that they meet several occasions in something which is called a council, and it's basically the 27 ministers of each country coming to discuss one topic. Small complication, it's not always the same people. So it's not like you have the same minister coming every time, it's basically coming per topic. So if there is a discussion on agriculture, you're gonna have the 27 ministers of agriculture from each country, and they're gonna be the council. But then 2 weeks later, you have a file discussed on, I don't know, immigration, you will have the 27 minister of immigration coming. So it's an institution in the sense that the logic, the box is the same, but then it's different people coming. But if you remember, okay, it's just because they're representing the states, and every state kind of, you know, brings someone to represent them. That's how it works. And then the third one, which is probably also the most known, I mean, it has become more known and known in the last decades, is the European Parliament, which is really this direct representation of citizens. Again, it's mediated through countries, because as, for those of you who are EU citizens, you can only vote for members of the European Parliament, so for MEPs that are from your country. But then, once they sit in the Parliament, they are not staying with the ones from their countries. I'll show something later. In the European Parliament, well, they are organized, like in another parliament, around political groups. Of course, you will have national faction and they will play a role, but originally, the idea is that European Parliament represents the voice of people and the different political trends that you will have across the continent, not the continent, or across the EU. So that, yeah, a little bit of a long explanation, but it's super important because of those having each a say and a role in decision making, whenever you're trying, as we are and as many other organizations are, whenever you're trying to influence EU policymaking, you kind of have to work with all of them. You have to be engaging with all of them at different stages. There's a couple of others around it. I'm not going to go long on it. I will talk a little bit about the European Central Bank because that's the one extra institution we are working, of course, the most with as positive money. So, European Central Bank, just a few words now. It's kind of a weird animal in the sense that it is an EU institution in itself. It does have a very important role, which is just to be in charge of the monetary policy of the EU, of the Eurozone, but then of the EU. And it has really a mandate, so that's an extract, you can't really read it, from the European Treaty that just gives like the mission to the European Central Bank of maintaining price stability at all times. It does also, that's quite interesting because that's the one thing that everyone knows about a central bank. It does change the interest rate, so to maintain inflation when it's too high or when it's too low, it just works with interest rate one way or the other way. That's kind of the one thing that everyone probably knows. And it's indeed price, well, it's not inflation, it's not interest rate, which is actually the mission, it's price stability, which is a little bit broader. And what is interesting is that it also has what we call then a secondary mandate. It also says very clearly, without prejudice of the objective of price stability, the ECB shall support the general economic policy in the Union in view to contribute to the achievement of the Union as Article 3, blah, blah. And there, what you can read here is that it refers to a broader objective of the European Union that are referring to pretty much everything and anything. It's referring to economic development, but also to sustainability, to improvement of quality of the environment, social progress, full employment, etc., etc. So that's something that is sometimes, it's often overlooked, that we think, okay, central bank or and especially ECB only has that interest rate, inflation, that's it, mission, whereas already in the treaties there is much more space for intervention on other aspects of European policy. Of course, with a bit of a caveat or something that can be a whole lecture in itself, is the question of independence. I'm sure you've heard of what's happening, well, in the US. So many things are happening in the US, but there is a big debate at the moment on Trump trying to remove the independence of the Fed, of the Federal Reserve, the equivalent of the ECB, and just trying to interfere with that independent mandate, which the core is the same, is also this interest rate element. And so that is something that is very important. We may or may not agree. There may be like discussions on whether that's the best way to deal with it, but the core of it is to say, okay, price stability in the long term should be going over short-term political interest. And because of the nature of policy making, shorter cycle of elections, etc., it's important to have this institution that has this kind of long-term view and can decide independently what to do, not being influenced by who is in power at that moment and wants or doesn't want something. It doesn't mean that the ECB can do whatever it wants, and it has actually a stronger, very strong accountability and transparency obligations, let's say, by, again, I'm coming back to the three main, by the other institutions. So the European Parliament is the one monitoring the ECB. So there's like very regularly, every month, I think, monetary dialogue they're called, so those kind of hearings in the Parliament. Every year the Parliament just reads a report on all the activities, gives recommendation. They also can give advice on who to appoint, etc. And yeah, Council and Commission are also consulted, etc. So there's a lot of interactions between all of those. Yeah, which I will then, I'm trying to remember why I put that in that order. Yeah, so just that's the general interaction. It's already in the treaty. What I want to come, which is a little bit more tricky, it is very tricky, but it's fine. The decision making. So maybe we don't look at that first because it's I explain first and then we can see how it goes. So it's a bit tricky because when it comes to monetary policy, as I said, the European Central Bank is independent. So independent, it means that actually it can decide how it does price stability. So for example, the fact that the ECB has decided we want to have 2% inflation on average in the midterm, that's their own decision. They could at some point say, oh, we consider that price stability is 1.5 or is 2.5. That is the kind of independence they have. They can't change price stability, but they can change the interpretation of it. And they are also fully independent in terms of what kind of tools they're going to use to do it, how they're going to manage their balance sheets, how they're going to, how much credit they're going to give to this or that. So those kind of things, that's where they have this kind of operational independence. Yet, going back to the rest, when it comes to actually making law in the EU, the ECB doesn't do it. The ECB is not elected. So outside this kind of general mandate, when it comes to, for example, the digital euro, if we were to have, if we were going to have a digital euro, even if the ECB, from a technical point of view, has developed a lot of ideas, they can't just decide we're going to have it. There needs to be, in this case, a law to do it. So that would be for digital euro, but that's kind of for anything, if I zoom out, if you think of whatever competitiveness, education, immigration, a lot of the policies, that is, I'm just going to explain a little bit how it works with the three main institutions, right? So, Commission, Council, and Parliament, they are the three co-legislators with a weird thing. So that's the thing which is weird. It's not like in a country with a government and a parliament. It's just not, the roles are not split the same way. The Commission is the only one that can propose a new legislation. So it's the right of initiative. So you will hear, like, in the past it used to be like, the Commission has released a white paper, a green paper, there's a lot of type of paper, or a proposal, a communication, a consultation. So the Commission, remember, with the interests of the EU as a whole in mind, will propose new legislation. And then, Commission proposal. And then the two, and that has changed a lot in the last 20, 30 years, Commission and Council and Parliament, so the representative of the states and the representative of the people, they are what we call co-legislator. And so they will have both to agree on the Commission proposals so that it becomes a law. What is a bit strange in the way it's done, so the Commission has a proposal, and then in parallel, you will have the Council working on what do we think of this proposal, what do we want to change, what is our position, and the Parliament is going to do the same in parallel. So that is a bit strange. It can last a few months, sometime a year. You will have, at the level of the Council, so it's basically each national, each country has a representation in Brussels. It's called a permanent representation with diplomats, etc., and experts. They will have a lot of technical meetings, discussion, negotiation, until they reach a general, it's called a general approach, so a text that they think they all agree as countries. We, 27 states, we agree on that. They usually use the qualified majority voting. I mean, it's not that important, but it's more or less, it's kind of a weird majority where you have to have 2/3 of the votes that represent X% of the population. I mean, it's kind of a, I forgot the details. It's not important, it's just to say that it's more than 50%. It has to be like solid agreement. And on some topics, it also has to be unanimity. So it has to be really quite strong. So they do that, they have a text. And in parallel, in the European Parliament, you have different committees. So like in a normal parliament, if you're dealing with an employment regulation, you will have the employment committee discussing it. They will appoint what is called a rapporteur, which is like a member of the European Parliament that will draft something. Then you have shadow rapporteurs, so from each political group, people making amendments, then they negotiate, they do compromise amendment, they vote in the committee, then they vote in the plenary. So all of that is happening. And so you end up with two positions, and then they have to make one position out of it. And so That is the thing you will not see actually when you read a normal textbook on EU institution. You will never read the word trilogue, even though this is the moment where, yeah, legislation is actually being made. So, because yeah, you can imagine, you could have a text from the council, a text from the parliament. Well, they're never going to be 100% the same, and sometimes they're quite different. So then you enter, after having this intra-institutional discussion, you enter in that phase of inter-institutional discussions. There can be a lot of informal elements, but then it's called trilogue because you will have the representative of the council, of the parliament, plus the commission, which is there, again, to guarantee the EU interest and with the sort of original proposal in mind. And that's where actually things are happening, behind closed doors, of course, sometimes for hours during the night until you have a deal. And then you have some compromise package. This is not really important. Then formally you have to sign, blah, blah, blah. In theory, if this doesn't work, if there's no agreement, you can go to a second reading with the same logic, and then even to a third reading if it doesn't work. In practice, about 80% of the files that are going through this procedure nowadays, they end in one go, in one reading, which it usually lasts something like between 1 year and 1.5 years for the full process. So this is a bit detailed, but I think it's important just why am I explaining all of that? Because what I'm trying to make as a point here that I will come afterwards is that when you have an idea, when you're developing a reform, when you're saying the world is not right and policy should be different, and it happens to be decided at the European level, this is how it's done, and these are all the places, all the moments where you can intervene, where you can influence. You can talk to so many people. You can talk to the rapporteur, which is the person in the European Parliament really drafting the first thing. You can talk to the opposition that are influencing and making amendments. You can talk to different countries that are making a majority. So there are a lot of entry points. It's quite complex, but it's also quite interesting because there are so many actors involved. Then you can also talk to many different actors. And I think one thing, what I always found the most hopeful in the EU, despite all the complexity, is that the potential to form a majority is much more open and much more flexible than in a national context, in most national contexts. I don't know, it depends on which country you're coming from, but in a lot of countries, you will elect a government once every 5, 4 years, whatever. If it's a majority government, it's pretty much like one party, one line. They have majority in the parliament as well, so it's just very clear, the program, what it is, and what the texts are going to be, what the laws are going to be. If you're in a coalition, there's a lot about that in Belgium, which is also happy complexity. You might have a little bit of discussions, etc., but eventually, so within the majority, but if you are in the opposition and you're not part of the government, even the coalition, you're just not going to have any ideas that are going to be implemented. So what is interesting with the EU is that you do not have a majority that is fixed. You do not have a government. With all those institutions I described, you don't have like a government that says, here is the program for the coming years, and here is, it's always going to be like that. So it means that every time per topic, different groups, different political interests can group together and make a coalition which is rather sort of on the topic by topic approach. And as I said, because you have all of those institutions involved, it also makes it more complex and longer, but it also makes it more open in terms of what can happen. So that said, since 2024, everything I just said is becoming more and more complex. So I have the experience of working in the European Parliament from 2009 to 2014, after the financial crisis where people were like, oh, okay, we need to do something about it. There had been a green wave in some countries. There was a lot of like flexibility, and what I described, and until last elections, that is the European Parliament. Until the last election, it was possible to do exactly what I said, so to have a coalition that would be either starting from the center and taking sort of a left coalition, or from the center to the right, without having to play with the far right and Eurosceptic and fascist, which unfortunately is not really the case anymore. So this is, yeah, I didn't introduce that, but it's quite a weird time also to be giving this lecture, because it's a time where the political context, I mean, I'm not, well, you're not learning anything, but the political context in the European but global level has changed so much. The polarization is so big, the shift to the right is so big that this has changed, and it is changing the rules of the game that I just described, also at the European level. So yeah, as you can see, since the last elections, basically, it's no longer possible to have a majority that would pass an alternative view just based sort of on a sort of left progressive vision. You will always have to go a little bit to the right. And there, coming back to your reflection that I saw in your eyes earlier, you can have country focus. It could be done on certain topics, even if some member of the European Parliament, some MEPs are belonging to a certain political group. It could be that a topic is more important to them. If you have countries that are, I don't know, have seas and are more interested in fisheries, you could have a different position. So you could also play a little bit with the sort of national coalition. But still, the fact that the European Parliament is so heavily right-wing centered, and especially with Eurosceptics, it makes it very difficult. And actually, in November, for the first time, you may have heard of it, for the first time, the EPP, so the EPP is the conservative, you can call it center, right-wing, depending. It's more or less Christian Democrats or right-wing liberals, depending on the countries. But they consider to be sort of the main, for a long time they were considered to be the mainstream and the sort of the biggest party. They basically made a deal with ECR, which is more on the right, but with the Patriots, which is, well, our friends, Le Pen, I forgot their name, I think it's on purpose, the Italian, anyway, Meloni, thank you. They made a deal on the omnibus package, which was the biggest attempt ever to basically dismantle a lot of the green and social regulation that were put in place in the previous term to facilitate business, etc. And that's like, it's very much a first in history, and that is changing very much how we can influence politics in the EU, but I think also in countries. And that is, it's kind of a cause and a consequence of, you can very much see in the EU a very big shift since especially the previous term, where you had Ursula von der Leyen first term, which quite unexpectedly came up with a very strong package on the Green Deal. I mean, of course, at the time, we were saying this is not enough, because it was already not enough for the climate challenges we have. But it was definitely a very transversal approach, where with the Green Deal approach, a lot of legislation were revised, you know, from building, energy efficiency, energy production, mobility, etc. They were revised with that Green Deal angle. You had the climate law adopted, you had new targets, etc. Of course, this was also pushed by the climate movement, the youth movement, etc. That happened around 2010, 2015, more or less. And yeah, today the buzzwords, what you see everywhere is competitiveness, simplification, security and defense. And it's very, why am I saying that? Of course, it's not really news, but what is interesting, I think the reason why we're putting that there is because influence, especially in this complex institutional context, it's also about narrative, about wording, about about words. I mean, it can be very frustrating, and not everyone wants to work in the EU, where you spend hours discussing like 2 words or a sentence, and you fight and you're happy when you manage to put like a sentence with a specific wording. But because of the complexity, the number of stakeholders and the long term that is involved, it does matter. And you do see in the long term the difference of using certain terms over others. And definitely the fact that today the framing, you can't go now to politicians and say, hey, we have super great ideas to reform the monetary system because it's going to be good for climate change. They don't care. Like, if you come and say, we have super great reforms that are good and are going to drive European competitiveness very higher and are going to be good for the sovereignty of the EU versus Russia and the US, then you can be heard. And even if then at the end of the day, then you try to keep the same position, but the framing and the narrative, the agenda is so powerful and so widespread that it's super important to, to adapt. That's also the way to not become depressed and thinking, oh my God, we can't do anything anymore. I mean, you can, but yeah, it has to be adapted. So yeah, that's what I was just saying. There is a clear shift. I think it's at the EU level, but if any of you are active in local groups or at other level, anyone with an ambition to change the system in whatever way, we know that it's just not the time, or it's just not the moment where the power balance is there. And so, yeah, I mean, you have two options. You could say, let's just wait. Some organizations are saying, yeah, we can't do anything in this term, so we might as well prepare for the next moment where politics shift and there is an opening and there we're ready with big reforms. That can be an option. Why not? We have chosen to say, well, we might as well just try to continue doing something. And so, as I was saying, since our topics are not on the agenda anymore and the majority is less receptive, then we want to change the tactics, the messages, and also the messenger. So there's also a good opportunity to try and be building alliances with other organizations. So for example, we have been working for a year with industry actors from the renewable sector that normally we don't work with. But we find that we can find common grounds with them, but because they are from the industry, they have better chance to be heard by some mainstream politics. So that's the kind of thing we can do. But of course, it's really hard because we have to put energy in safeguarding some of the basic stuff that were a given a few years ago and now are under threat. I mean, I'm only talking about green stuff, but of course it's even worse when you talk about democracy and just basic threat to all of that. But yeah, what I was referring to, the omnibus package, which there's going to be more of, is really this kind of systematic dismantling of the good work that was done on green and social reforms previously. And a lot of NGOs have been just mobilizing to fight against it. And at some point when you realize, oh, it is going to pass, then you also have to say, okay, what can we do, what can we propose as amendment and stuff like that to make sure that at least not everything is destroyed, and also to think tactically, what can we keep that allow us to rebuild later? That's the kind of thinking we have to be. And yeah, and the less funding, question mark, it's less important, but in the long term, that might also have an impact. We've seen already in the US how some massive programs have been 100% defunded, but it's also the reality that a lot of charities or philanthropies in the US are funding European organizations that are funding organizations like us, for example, and that has like a big impact. Or same, if you think of the European priorities shifting, the European Union is also giving research money or money for citizens project, etc. All of that has an impact. So yeah, not so fun, but still, we are trying to advance. And I don't think I'm going to be able to explain much of the technical stuff, but it's okay, because as I said, it's not my thing. And we can have questions later on. I still wanted to give you then a bit more of a practical case on what it means to influence EU policies when it comes to monetary policy, and specifically to green monetary policy, which is a big part of what we have been doing. First of all, why should we care? Yeah, it's just awesome. Yeah, why should we care about monetary policy? I don't know if I have to convince you or not. No, it's just because myself, I've been always very convinced by the fact that the economic system is just the core of so many things, and should be at the service of society and planet, and is kind of the other way around. And in a way, monetary policy is one of the small core of the core, which makes it a little bit difficult to understand and a bit distant and a bit technical, but it is still super important because it's one of the tools of public policy. it's when you want to influence, or as a politician or as whoever is making decision, you do have different tools to set the economy in a certain direction. You can have taxes, you can have subsidies, you can have regulatory elements, so putting norms, creating definition on what is good and not good, and monetary policy, which is essentially what you do with inflation. How do we influence how easy it is to borrow money, where do you put money in the economy? It's part of that system. So it's important. It has a very strong influence because there is so much potential for money to flow in the economy. I did note some numbers. The ECB is it has around 11 billion euros in capital. So it's spread in the different central banks of the countries, but it's like a massive amount of money. That decision on where this money goes, where it is channeled to, it can have a very massive multiplier effect. Also because the ECB, of course, it has this monetary policy role, but it also has this supervisory role on putting rules for the others, also for the financial actors, for the banks, etc., setting the example. So there's a big snowballing effect that is possible. And as I said at the beginning, I'm not going to dive deeper into that, but the democratic importance of money and of keeping public institutions in charge of money is so important. It's a bit overlooked. A lot of people don't know how money is created, but basically a lot of the money, most of the money in circulation in the economy is created by commercial banks through interest, loans, etc. But all of that is, if you think of it, is basically relying on commercial banks whose interest is to make money on their own without any kind of obligation to respect people's rights, etc., privacy, etc. So in that sense, making sure that central banks remain holder of that money creation power, back to the digital euro, so at the moment it's the only public money, the actual public money is only the banknotes and coins, and that should remain the case. Not going to go into that. We can go later if you want to dive into that topic, and actually Bruno is a specialist, so he will be able to tell you more. And so when we start working on all of that, or eventually the question is, okay, they do all of that, but what does it have to do with climate? What does it have to do with environmental protection? Why should central banks care? What is the connection, right? So in general terms, there are many others, but these are the most obvious way of understanding what is the connection and why we then can argue with facts and with arguments for green monetary policy. First of all, if you come back, so remember the first mandate that central banks, European central banks should care for price stability. That's like why they exist, basically. Over the last years, price stability has been and is increasingly and hugely influenced by climate-related factors. So there are two trends that are coined. I don't know if we coined them like that or we're part of the people who coined them like that. Fossil inflation and climateflation. So it's actually very simple. Fossil fuel are super volatile, like the price of fossil fuel. This is not news. This has been the case ever since first shock in the 70s, probably. And because the price of fossil fuels is so quickly moving, but also because all of the economy is still so dependent on fossil fuels, any shock or any small change in fossil fuel prices has a massive impact on inflation. It has a direct impact and it has an indirect impact by, well, all the rest of the production or the food, etc. There is a number that in the energy crisis a few years ago, around the Russian-Ukraine war, how was it? Around 60% of the euro peak was due to just the fossil fuel. So it is of the interest of the central bank to care about that element if they want to be serious about inflation. Same with climate. Basically, is the argument that a lot of the rising temperature overall, but then extreme weather events also have shock effects that are drivers of the inflation. So if you think of, for example, when you have a massive heat wave, you have drought in the crops, and then you have food prices hiking, that is like a massive driver of inflation. So you have a lot of those elements that are just core. They're not like complementary. They're just actually nowadays structural drivers of inflation and should be then included as in the design of the policies. That's what we're arguing. And also a bit more broadly, if you think of the fact that the ECB is supposed to help maintaining sort of financial stability overall, you have this notion that more general risks are related to climate. So it's not only that inflation is gonna increase when you have, for example, a big flood or whatever, it's also that it will cause damage, physical damage, like, you know, to whatever, production side or whatever, that will create changes of the values of those assets, even just on a pure economically basis. You might have, this liability risk, so people affected by climate change is starting to sue others and having responsibility, etc. You have also what we call transition risk, which is that in the effort of moving away from fossil fuel, it does make, well, it just changed the value of assets, it just changed also production capacities, etc. So all of that are just structural elements that are weighing so much on what the ECB should care about. And then what we're also arguing, but that can be less powerful now that we are in this political context that is a bit different, but according to the treaty, as I showed you earlier, it is part of the secondary mandate of the ECB to contribute to the objective of the European Union and to contribute to sustainability. Of course, this was easier to argue for when the agenda of the Commission was the Green Deal. It's more difficult to argue for in the current context, but still to make the argument that as an EU institution, the ECB is bound by the Paris Agreement, for example, it's actually the case. So that's how we see things. And so I think if I just summarize, and I close there very soon, there are two ways then you could think of how to have a green monetary policy, conceptually, that then translated in a lot of tools. The first one is what the ECB has been doing quite a bit since Lagarde took her office, and she has been increasing the sustainability approach, but very much from a sort of risk-based approach. So this means that the ECB is more and more, and other central banks in the world are more and more considering, oh yeah, what you're saying is true. There are risk factors that are related to climate, so we should make sure that we take them into account in our own balance sheet, and that we make sure that we understand, that we can reduce that. It doesn't mean, which is the other approach, which we are promoting much more and it's less working. It doesn't mean that they are yet taking a proactive approach in which they could say, oh, we have a lot of power and we could, with the design of our own monetary policy, we could influence the economy to accelerate the green transition, for example, or to reduce the fossil fuel dependence. So those are like, it's too a softer, let's say weaker, just not changing the system kind of approach, but still necessary to take into account the new risk, and you have a more proactive approach. And so just a few examples of what we mean by a proactive approach. Two examples that we've been advocating for a long time, for a few years, and that are not there yet, but moving forward. One very big tool that central banks and the green monetary policy, the ECB could have to have a proactive role in the fight against climate change would be to have a preferential interest rate. So sometimes it's called dual rate, or it's called TLTROs, for targeted long-term refinancing operation, green one. So it's basically one of the mechanisms by which the ECB can refinance banks. And what we've been arguing with others is that you could basically say, when it's a bank that is going to give money themselves to support the green transition, then the ECB has the power to say, with this criteria, in this case, we can have a lower interest rate just to stimulate that. So it's really targeting what you want. I mean, the ECB can do it. And when we talk about, when I talk about that independence, that's part of what they could do. They don't need someone to tell them they can do it with the toolbox they have. And so that's the kind of thing that could be really accelerating super easily the investment in the green transition. Another one is working with the collateral framework. So basically, whenever banks or other institutions are coming to refinance themselves or borrow more money from DCB, they have to give collateral, so they have to basically show some guarantees. And there you already have like an obligation to have good quality, let's say, assets. And basically there, it's also a place where you would have a lot of potential to say, we will give more weight, or DCB would give more weight to those assets that are green. If you're coming with assets that are coming from fossil fuel companies, those are have a higher haircut, so those are weighing less. So that's the kind of thing where there are a lot of different criteria. We can go into more technical after, but the logic of saying, with the tools that the ECB has to today, then same, I think I put it at the last one, with their own asset purchase program. At the moment, the ECB owns still massively, well, the vast majority of the assets are still related to fossil fuel industries. And they did it a little bit, so which is tilting a little bit their portfolio towards those other kind of assets. And I think a lot of it has to do then with the kind of scales and with how much you're putting the criteria very strongly or not. And what I put as extra, it would also then be more effective if you have a coordination with also fiscal and regulatory policy. Because of course, if you're only saying interest rates are low for bank lending to renewable industry, for example, if you don't have, if you have at the same time the government saying, oh, we're going to have subsidies and we're also going to have easier regulations and norms, that would even more have that multiplier effect. So having that coordination is quite interesting, but then brings in a lot of complexity because we're back with a lot of other institutions. And I didn't talk much about that, but that other role of the ECB, which is also to have some supervisory kind of role, it could also be playing like the same sort of criteria. So for example, you have to have, at the moment, since 2008, 2009, the reserve requirement of banks have been increased a lot, so making sure that they don't just bankrupt at the same time, like it happened, more or less. And so same, you could say not only, oh, you need that amount of reserve, you could also say the quality of the reserve you need is linked to the type of assets that you have that are, for example, linked to green stuff. And I think the point there is that it's not so much, it's both, if I come back to, saying that it's both the ECB taking into account what actually is a risk today for the economy and the financial stability, so climate and energy strike, those are risks, so doing that is good for them and for the economic system, but also by having those kind of elements, they would themselves be contributing to climate objectives, but also reducing then the cause of that risk. So it's kind of like a double element. It's a win-win. I don't know why they don't do it. And so why they don't do it? Because good ideas are not enough. No, I just wanted to finish with that, saying that these are all the ideas we and others have developed that makes a lot of sense, and there's then a lot of papers explaining it, and there are a lot of people in academia that are developing. This is like the niche of a niche, but for every single sector, you will have many people developing super great ideas on how to change the system. But it's very important to remember that ideas just don't translate into action like that. Everything I said before is just one element, but you have to play, and that's what we're trying to do with others, you have to play on all the aspects. There is the discourse, there is this kind of awareness raising, agenda setting in the world as it is now. If the news is only talking about security and competitiveness, there's no point, that's not enough. So part of what we're trying to do with others is to, put the things on the agenda. How do you do that? Yeah, some of the social media work with yourself, but then you try to have interviews, try to talk to other people, connect your own messages with what is going on, what is the news in the EU agenda, and have a quote in an interview on something else. So a lot of like small steps, but trying to have the discourse, like compensating a bit the mainstream. We do a lot of coalition building. I think that's very important. Also, if you ever want to work in organizations that are trying to change things, everyone at some point teams up with others because, yeah, it's still more efficient. You can keep your own, you need to keep your own sort of strength. But for example, just about a month ago or less, we had this open letter that we organized with another organization. We had 70, actually, university people signing it in favor of a digital euro. And because there were several of us, we had contacts, we managed to put it in the Financial Times, we managed to have some interviews. So it's this kind of snowballing effect that works a bit better when you're working in coalition, also trying to increase your credibility. But so all of that, again, because who do you address when you do that? You can, for example, address people at the ECB, even if they don't have the political power, they are the one, well, developing the ideas, developing the technique. You can address it at the Commission, because even if they don't decide eventually, they are the one putting the proposal, the first wording on the table. So it's important that your first wording is going in some direction. Or when you have a vote coming up in the European Parliament, important to do some campaigns, some direct email, some social media push, etc. So there's a lot around, yeah, that influence, which seems a little bit fluffy, but it's a sum of all of those actions that make a difference, together with interaction. So we do have, like other organizations, we do have those direct interaction with ECB, with also other central bankers. I didn't talk about that, but there are also central banks in the different countries that also have different interests. When you have good contacts with them, then it's also a way to be informed earlier, to have an informal draft of some text that then you can act upon. And same when it comes to like what I was talking about earlier, when you have a legislation happening in the council, in the parliament, then we will, for example, write small policy brief, we'll propose amendments to MEPs. I underline that we don't ask for money and that is not legal and you shouldn't be doing it, but then, yeah, having meetings with MEPs and saying, hey, look, we have those ideas, what do you think? Here is how you could translate it into text. They take it, they don't take it, that's their choice. But that's the kind of thing that then, yeah, makes the work advancing. So sometimes there are some successes. Unfortunately, most of them are from the previous term. That's an example where the European Parliament had a resolution. You can see the green dots. That's 452 votes. That's quite a strong majority to affirm that the ECB should respect the Paris Agreement. So that's the kind of thing we work towards. So of course, this is not binding, this is just a declaration, but still, it's all those kind of actions that change and shift politics. The radical left is sometimes, it's also, it might be that it's like the non-inscrit. Sometimes you have like the non-affiliated are, yeah. The radical, the right there is always red most of the time, just against anything. Interesting also, we had also this notion of a green dual rate. The idea of having this preferential rate for green investment is an idea that has been making its way. So you have Lagarde, but also Isabelle Schnabel, which is one of the board members, so the highest executive body of the ECB. Of course, again, it's quite weak language. It might be worth considering in the future. So you see that, it's like, okay, that's not great. For us, it's like, yes, great victory. No, it's one of the steps. This was 2022, 2023. We definitely see now that there has been a bit of a hold put there. For example, France was very strong and now it's not so much anymore. So that also plays a role. But the fact that you have leaders like that can be saying stuff like that, it also means that their team might be influenced, are starting to write. So that is advancing a bit. And so what I was saying earlier, in 2021, you did have really quite, with Lagarde, I mean, she was the first ECB president to be a little bit going in that direction. And so they put together that strategy, action plan for climate, but a lot of it has been really just this risk-based approach. And a lot of it that was announced a few years ago hasn't really materialized. We will see big announcement from last summer, that the ECB announced that they were going to include a climate factor in the collateral. So one of the things I said we advocate for a long time. It's yet to be seen how it's going to be translated. So we will continue. Good change is too slow, but we'll continue.